Hello everyone, welcome to today's talk on history and methodology in economics, and today's topic is John Maynard Keynes and his followers. I'm Jaromír Baxa from Charles University. The main objectives of this talk is to understand what is new in the works by John Maynard Keynes, to learn the principles of Keynes which entered the neoclassical synthesis, and also to learn what has been lost during this transition, and to recognize the importance of financial instability hypothesis in modern economics. So this is him, Mr. John Maynard Keynes, born in 1883, died in 1946. He was born in Cambridge. He then won a scholarship at Eton and studied at King's College in Cambridge, first philosophy and mathematics, and then he was advised to move to economics by Alfred Marshall. He started his career in civil service in 1908, and very shortly after he also started his career in academia. He's been a Renaissance man with a lot of passions, and one of those passions was his own portfolio, which is set to overtake the British index by 8% per year consistently. So when he's writing about financial markets, he's pretty much discussing his own experience as well. And over his life, he's been very active in public discussions of the interwar era, and he gained a celebrity status even before his masterpiece, The General Theory, was written and published. He gained his celebrity status by two short pieces written in 1920s. And the first one is called The Economic Consequences of Peace, written and published in 1920. John Maynard Keynes was, on behalf of the British Treasury, a delegate at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, where he was supposed to discuss and to negotiate the conditions of reparations and also of the overall economic environment for the 1920s. And he was very critical in this book towards what has been negotiated. He personally argued for a generous peace with very low war reparations, and he also proposed in the book general forgiveness of debt and large credit program for Europe financed by the United States. He was persuaded that the conditions that were negotiated are neither good for for allies, but so not only for Germany. And he was thinking that the conditions that were negotiated undermine the future well-being of Europe. However, the rest is the history, as is sometimes said. The conditions of the peace were quite fierce, especially towards Germany, and this shaped the ongoing political development in Europe in the next decades. Somewhat paradoxically, even though Keynes himself was very liberal, political liberal, he shaped the political environment and public debate in the UK so much that this small piece, this small book, contributed to rise of the popularity of an appeasement movement, which is quite paradoxical, as he was a political liberal and he personally was very strongly against Nazism in Germany, and he never considered German economic reforms as something inspirative for other countries and for him personally. The second big event of 1920s reflected by John Maynard Keynes was the return to gold standard. Actually, it's been one of the imperative of the 1920s in the United Kingdom. It's been believed that the prosperity of the interwar era will return together with the return of gold standard. In particular, if such a return would achieve at the pre-war parity to the US dollar. This was quite a tremendous task given the fact that the prices in the United Kingdom in the mid of 1920s were multiple times higher than they were in before. So deflation and fierce austerity was necessary to deflate the prices to the pre-war levels. What was so popular on gold standard that time and what is popular on gold standard until now is a feature that gold standard works to some extent automatically. When there is a current account deficit and the current account balance is negative, then what appears is an outflow of money abroad and also outflow of gold. And if the gold standard should be kept, then there should be an automatic monetary reaction of monetary policy that the money supply has to decrease, and also then the prices will decrease. And if the prices will decrease, then the real exchange rate is supposed to decrease as well, which has beneficial effects for exports. And if those exports improve, then the current account is just back to its to the equilibrium, and the balance of gold restores. However, to make this mechanism working, wages have to be very flexible, and the same holds for prices. And those wages are not that flexible in real world, so that's why the gold standard is sometimes associated with chronic recessions and chronic unemployment. Still, gold standard is quite popular till today. And that time, the gold standard was very popular in the city of London, which had large stock of foreign assets denominated in sterling. And appreciation of sterling, especially towards the pre-war parity with US dollar, would lead to high profits of the bank. So the London city devoted a lot of energy to persuade the British prime ministers and was then successful with the Chancellor, Mr. Winston Churchill, who re-established the gold standard of British pound in 1925, although it had devastating effect on British industry. The effect was so devastating that if we have a look at the data of British industry or British GDP of the interwar era, the Great Depression looks there as a minor blip in comparison to a madness spurred by the return to gold standard in 1925. This return to gold was passionately criticized by Keynes as well in his work called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, published in 1925. And it's been very criticized by also other economists, and until it's been finally abandoned in 1931 in the midst of the Great Depression later on. However, that time policy discussions of 1920s were not yet dominated by active participation of a state in economic policy. Rather, that time view can be, or is called the treasury view, is all about advocating laissez-faire, and it's very much also against public works to help unemployed, and against all other interventions of a state in the economy. It's based on the belief that investment which are necessary for economic growth arise from savings, and so if the state spends more money than absolutely necessary, then basically the savings are being used unproductively, and if the savings are used unproductively by the state, then we are creating obstacles to future economic growth because the investments by the entrepreneurs are lower. So that was the intellectual environment of pre-depression and pre-depression era in the United Kingdom and also in the United States, and something what changed quite heavily in the upcoming decade. And John Maynard Keynes, together with Arthur Cecil Pigou and other economists at the time, contributed a lot to such a change in a public in public debate. Here's one of the provocative quotes by John Maynard Keynes, one of my favorite, which also summarizes or which reflects the provocative thoughts which John Maynard Keynes was famous for. So let me give a word to John Keynes and his quote that the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones. I think this small quote really captures the spirit which is embedded in the two works which we mentioned right now, in the economic consequences of peace and also in the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill, in which John Keynes wanted to debunk the problems of that time thinking. His main work is, however, actually something different. His main work is a general theory of employment, interest, and money, published in 1936. And this book is quite difficult to read. So let's sort out what is the very main intuition within the book and the very main component of the theory. In the core lies the interactions between savings, investment, liquidity, and money. Actually, Keynes, as well as classics, believed in the identity between savings and investment. However, while the classics considered the savings as being the source and the prerequisite for investment, Keynes considered the identity between savings and investment as something that holds only ex post, because both savings and investment are determined independently. Savings, according to Keynes and also according to many other scientists later on, are simply a function of income, that is, the aggregate savings, big S, equal to S as a function of output. And it's not only a function of aggregate output, also the savings of households depend on their income, which implies that each of us have some marginal propensity to consume, and this marginal propensity of consume is a function of our income, and we have some level of consumption that we need to secure our living. And then there is some consumption which is on luxury goods and what non-necessary goods that in which we decide whether to buy something or whether to keep our money in a form of savings. Obviously, the rich people save much more than the poor people, and that's because the savings function is just like that. On the other hand, investment are a function of profitability. We can formulate a profitability with an acronym MPK, which is the marginal productivity of capital. And this marginal productivity of capital has to be larger than the real interest rate, otherwise the investment is not being undertaken by the entrepreneur. Why not? Because if the marginal productivity, the expected marginal productivity is lower, then basically it is more worth to keep the money in the bank rather than to invest them into any productive activity. Therefore, the investment function is a relative complex function with where our marginal productivity of capital, interest rate, and a lot of other even subjective variable like expectations about the future demand and so on. There is another thing which is connected with savings and investment, and it is a phenomenon which is called liquidity preference. Keynes discussed in his general theory also the question why people actually hold money. And he discussed several motives. One is that people hold money just to get money for transactions. That's the so-called transaction demand for money. Then also for storage of value. And in both cases, fiat money, simply currency, has a big advantage over other options other options of storing the value, that they are liquid, that one can exchange the money for anything at instantaneously. However, it is quite impossible to reverse some investments without any adjustment costs, which means that people tend to prefer liquidity over other types of investment. So the marginal productivity of investment has to be really higher than the real interest rate to make the investment happen. We will discuss the general theory of of employment, interest, and money during the lecture. And here's a list of topics for discussion that we will discuss in the lecture. So first, we'll discuss why Keynes called his book a general theory. Then, what does he consider as a problem of classical theory? We will also discuss the theory of effective demand and why the theory of effective demand is central to Keynes' theory. Finally, we'll talk about full employment, whether the full employment is assured in a Keynesian world or not, and also what is the role of expectations and human psychology. Keynes been very active in discussions even after publication of his main work. And what we can observe on his book, on his general theory, is that it doesn't contain much mathematics, which is quite different to many economic books of that time and that were published later, which are very often full of mathematical proofs and mathematical formulas. However, although Keynes was a mathematician by himself, actually he gained his BA degree in mathematics at Cambridge. He was quite skeptical to a possibility to use mathematical models to describe the complexity of economic relations. And he also kept distance from econometrics, which started to emerge that time. This is especially apparent from a so-called Keynes-Tinbergen debate of 1939 and 1940. Jan Tinbergen was a Dutch economist who belonged to a first generation of econometricians which used statistical data to calibrate macroeconometric models and to use them to simulate the impacts of economic policy. And Tinbergen was also asked by the League of Nations to use econometrics to analyze business cycles. However, Keynes was very skeptical to this effort and also to the outcomes of Tinbergen's team. And he believed that with statistics we can just describe several facts, but we cannot build theories which are in which the causal links are the most important features. Why he was so skeptical is summarized in his quotation from his paper, from his response to Tinbergen's article. And what is he saying here? that it will be remembered that the 70 translator of Septuagint were shut up in 70 separate rooms with a Hebrew text and brought out with them when they emerged 70 identical translations. Then Keynes asked, would the same miracle be vouchsafed if 70 multiple correlators were shut up with the same materials? Obviously, Keynes thinks that it wouldn't, because every empirical work is necessarily influenced by a subjective a priori choices of econometricians, for example, to which variables to include in economic models. And this leads to inevitable biases according to Keynes. You can think about it, whether such criticism is valid or not. However, this objection towards econometrics is perhaps something that shouldn't be remembered, even though the history of economics as a discipline moved later on to a wide acceptance of econometrics, just for a particular simple reason that without econometrics we won't be able to provide quantitative predictions, which are actually one of the essence of the work of economists today. Anyway, Keynesian work and Keynesian the works by Keynes inspired a lot of young economists who try to address several issues and problems in Keynesian pieces. In particular, they wanted to formalize the general theory with all its richness, to reduce perhaps all its richness into macroeconomic and into formal models, which could then be used for teaching and for modeling, because it's been believed that the mathematical models in the Marshallian, in the spirit of Alfred A. Marshall, are a good thing for economists. And among others, who mainly contributed were John Hicks already in 1930s, and then younger economists from the US, Franco Modigliani and Paul Samuelson, who restated the Keynes ideas in mathematical models. Here on the picture, you can see a small snapshot of a paper by John Hicks in which he tried to restate the main ideas of general theory into mathematical models, so that he developed something what has been later called the ISLM model. What the ISLM model is about, it is a simple macroeconomic model in which we see on the horizontal axis output, and denoted as I, as an income, and then there's the interest rate on the vertical axis, and there are two curves within the graph. The first one is the IS curve here, downward sloping, which basically maps the investment demand and which links which represents the identity between investment and savings for a given level of income and interest rate. Then beyond this function is a presumption that that investment depend on consumption, which is in fact one of the conclusions which can be found in Keynesian general theory. The second curve is the LM curve, denoted just with L here, and this LM curve is a basically function with a demand on money, and the demand on money is supposed to depend on income and interest rate. And the main idea of this model is that active fiscal policy can basically increase the actual level, can push the IS curve to the right, and to increase output in exchange for a marginal increase in interest rate. John Hicks then discusses what what is actually the Keynesian world and what is perhaps the classical world in this diagram, and he came up with a distinction that if the LM curve is horizontal, so that there is a lot of liquidity on the market, then it corresponds to a Keynesian world. However, with some higher levels of income, the LM curve starts to be vertical, which is apparent on figure 2, and this represents the economy at full capacities where where the expansion of fiscal policy will lead just to an increase in interest rate and not to an expansion of the overall economy, which is then connected with the neoclassical world of complete markets. In fact, the ISLM model summarizes the neoclassical synthesis then popularized in the 1940s, 1950s, and in 1960s. Here, it is assumed that basically the Keynesian world is something what holds in the short term. However, in the long term, we can still accept a neoclassical world in which prices are flexible and adjustment towards the equilibrium is possible. During the lecture, we then discuss a couple of issues with that. We'll ask what is lost from the Keynesian work in this neoclassical synthesis, and we also try to discuss whether Keynes would agree with the main implications of these simplified models. Obviously, we can also touch this another famous quotation quote by John Keynes, that the long run is a misleading guide to the current affairs. Why? Just because in the long run we are all dead. And this summarizes the skepticism of John Keynes to the belief that in the long run we can accept the implications and the conclusions of the neoclassical economics. Then we will also cover and discuss during the lecture Hyman Minsky, perhaps the most inspiring and original thinker of Keynesian followers of post-Keynesians. Hyman Minsky was born in 1919. He died in 1996. He was a professor of economics at the Washington University in St. Louis in the US. And he's very famous for developing the financial instability hypothesis, which explains why and how financial crises arise. And in particular, he explains why financial instabilities and financial crises are a typical feature of capitalist economies. Not something special, not something that falls from heaven and emerges due to some failures of the economies. He believes that financial instability is simply an inherent feature which is embedded into very main grounds of modern economies. And we will discuss this theory and how financial crises arise in economies, and we'll also discuss the policy implications which come up from this work, because the policy implications are still important for us in these days. The financial instability hypothesis, to some extent, can be summarized by this simple graphics published in The Economist, which summarizes how we are all during the good times approaching the hill, which has been later called the Minsky moment, after which a financial crisis and panic appears. So thank you for watching this video, and Looking forward to meet you during the lecture and to discuss all the interesting aspects of the works by John Maynard Keynes, and also on discussion on financial instability hypothesis by Hyman Minsky. And let me end up this video with another quote by John Keynes, which reflects his desire for economists being pragmatic when thinking about their theories when they are facing the reality. That the reality should be basically the benchmark for us, not simply the mathematical purity. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.